My son's, he's been sleepwalking, and I don't know how to stop him. When he's awake, Mason is the funniest, smartest little kid I know. He started talking at 6 months, and we like to joke that he hasn't shut up since. He's always coming up with these crazy stories. He taught himself to read when he was only 3 years old. I've never met a 4-year-old who could follow adult conversations like he does, and who genuinely understands most of the words we use. Most importantly, he is a sweet little boy, but when he's asleep. One night, a few weeks ago, I was carrying Mason's baby brother up to his crib. Mason had been in bed for a few hours, and the last time we checked the video monitor, he was fast asleep in his bed, one hand clutching the little blue blanket that's been his favorite since he was born, the other flung out across the sheets. He always looks like a little angel when he's sleeping. Soft, curly brown hair, pale skin that's just starting to show signs of freckles, full lips, impossibly long eyelashes. He's a restless sleeper, and the blankets were already tangled around him, half hanging on the floor. We learned a long time ago that it's not really worth it to tuck him back in. After an hour or so, the sheets will be wadded up again. He doesn't seem to get cold and usually sleeps 10 to 12 hours a night. The way our second floor is set up, when you reach the last step, you're facing the bathroom at the end of a short hall. There are doors on each side of the hallway, the master bedroom to the right, Mason's and Ryan's rooms to the left. As soon as you reach the top floor, you're looking into a mirror, with doorways on both sides. The setup doesn't seem to bother my husband, but I'm nearly phobic about mirrors and always make the right turn as quickly as possible to avoid looking at my reflection. That night, I had stayed up later than I usually do, reading scary stories on the internet while I waited for the baby to fall asleep for the night. He doesn't like to fall asleep in a dark room, so I usually wait for him to pass out in his portable bassinet and then carry him, still sleeping, up to the bed. He had been particularly fussy due to his emerging teeth, and I must have read a dozen stories before he finally gave it up and started snoring. I cradled him there, breathing in his milky baby smell, and carried him carefully up the stairs. When I reached the top, I turned sharply to the right, trying to keep my eyes off the mirror since I was already jumpy and paranoid. Suddenly, I realized there was something standing between me and my bedroom. I swallowed a shriek as I realized it was Mason, standing in the hallway and staring at me with a peculiar smile on his face. "Hi, baby," I managed unsteadily, hoping my voice and my thunderous heartbeat wouldn't wake the baby. He didn't speak. His hair was mussed from sleep, his curls sticking out in a way that would have been completely adorable if he hadn't just scared the hell out of me. "You need to go back to bed," I told him. "It's late. He swayed slightly, his eyes completely unfocused, but didn't move. "Mason," I realized as I said his name that he couldn't really hear me. I used to sleepwalk as a child too, and knew that it would be best if I could get him back to bed without waking him. I stepped around him and settled Ryan into his crib, slipping his pacifier into his mouth. Mason was still standing there, though, when I turned around, so I took his hand and led him back into his room. He followed me without comment or complaint and climbed compliantly into his little bed. I pulled his Paw Patrol blanket up around him, kissed his forehead, and watched as his eyes closed once more. Smiling slightly, I replaced the baby gate at the top of the stairs, walked back across the hall into our room, and texted my husband. He was downstairs playing on his laptop, and I told him that Mason had been sleepwalking and to watch out for the baby gate when he came to bed. I settled the phone next to me and dropped off into sleep, now amused by Mason's nighttime adventure. When I woke, it was dark and quiet. I could hear Ryan snoring softly in his crib, and felt the weight of my husband next to me in the bed. I lay there for a moment, trying to figure out what had awakened me. Then I glanced at the time on my phone, 3:07 a.m. There were no missed calls or texts, and I still wasn't sure why I'd awakened just then, but I shrugged it off and started to go back to sleep. Maybe one of the cats had walked on me. As my eyes started to close, I glanced over at the doorway. There was a small, dark shape there. I started up in bed. Images of ghosts and monsters started flashing through my brain before I realized it was just Mason. I definitely wasn't reading those stories before bed again. I pitched my voice low so I wouldn't wake the baby. "What's wrong, Mace? Do you need to go potty?" I knew the zipper on his pajamas was sometimes too much for him in the middle of the night. He didn't answer. I saw the glint of his eyes as he stood there, the blank expression on his face, and felt a creeping cold tickle its way up my spine. "Mason." He smiled, turned around and walked back across the hallway to his room. I got out of bed and followed him, but when I saw that he had tucked himself back into bed, I sighed in relief and headed back to my own bed. It was unusual to have 2 sleepwalking episodes in one night, but not completely unheard of. My mother, a psychologist, had told me that gifted children were more prone to sleepwalking and night terrors, and I reminded myself as I dozed off that it was just another sign of his intelligence, albeit a creepy one. When I mentioned the incidents to him the next day, his little face creased in a frown. "I didn't go for a walk last night, Mommy. I was sleeping." "That's why it's called sleepwalking, Sugar Pie. You're still asleep when you do it. It's like you were sleeping, but your body decides to go and do something else." He nodded, processing this information, and took another bite of his cereal. "Why did I do that?" "Well, we're really not sure. You're a very smart little boy, so maybe your brain doesn't completely turn off like other people's. It's still thinking and planning things, and it makes your body walk around without your permission. That's pretty funny, huh?" I asked, trying to lighten things up. I hated seeing that serious look on his face. "Your body going and doing things without you?" He shook his head, staring at me, his beautiful brown eyes shining in the sunlight that came through the window of our breakfast nook. Very quietly he asked, "Was it very scary, Mommy?" He pronounced it very scary. He may have a large vocabulary, but he's still a little kid. I was completely blown away by his question and the empathy it showed. Most preschoolers don't understand others' emotions, and even fewer of them can identify those emotions if the other person is trying to hide them. "Well," I hedged, "maybe a little bit, until I realized what was going on. Then I was just worried you were going to hurt yourself, wandering around the house in the middle of the night. We're going to put up that old baby gate back up for a while, okay?" "Okay, I don't want to scare you, Mommy. I love you." My heart melted, just a little, the way it does every time he says that. "I love you too, Sugar Pie." There were no incidents for the next few days, at least. Nothing out of the ordinary. We made it through a couple of potty accidents, a tantrum or two, and a battle royale over whether or not he was going to eat his dinner. I won that one. But he stayed in his bed, and by Monday I'd almost forgotten about it. We were keeping the baby gate up, though, just in case. I carried Ryan up to his crib and tiptoed across the hall to check on Mason. He was sound asleep, snoring a little, his mouth hanging open. I crept back across the hall and climbed into bed. I had a little trouble falling asleep, and was still awake an hour later when my husband climbed in next to me. I listened to his slow, even breathing until I fell asleep too. We awakened to a crash from downstairs. Both of us sat bolt upright in the bed as Ryan started to cry. Quickly we pulled the covers down and my husband picked up the baby to comfort him as I rushed downstairs. I paused for a moment, noticing that the baby gate had been opened, then ran down the stairs as fast as I dared in the dark. Mason was a dark shape atop the kitchen table. I quickly slapped the light on and he stared at me, unblinking, the same blank expression on his face. In one hand, he held a vase that had been holding flowers only a few hours ago. There were rose petals scattered everywhere and a spreading puddle of water on the tabletop. One of the chairs had been overturned. "What are you doing?" I demanded, hands on my hips as I surveyed the disaster in my dining room. I knew he was probably sleepwalking again, but asking the question made me feel a little more in control of the situation. To my surprise, he held up the vase. I needed something to hold Aunt Katie. Aunt Katie wasn't actually his aunt, but a good friend of mine who came over sometimes to play with him so we could get work done around the house or take a date night. Mason had told me many times that he wished Aunt Katie could come and live with us forever. She was always singing songs with him, coming up with crazy art projects, helping him with his stories. She was endlessly patient, never too busy or tired to play. Basically, she was the mother I thought I'd be, before I actually had kids. I started laughing. I couldn't help it. People say the most ridiculous things in their sleep. I think Aunt Katie's a little too big to fit in there, buddy. Still staring at me, though his eyes were completely unfocused. He smiled a tiny, sharp smile that sliced right through my laughter. In that moment, he looked like a stranger to me, an imposter wearing my son's skin. Not anymore. I shook my head, thoroughly creeped out by this tiny stranger in the rocket ship pajamas. Right. What do you say we get you back to bed? Without another word, he put his arms out to me. I helped him down from the table and we walked back up the stairs to his room. As before, he got back into bed and tucked himself in, closing his eyes before I'd even kissed him goodnight. I staggered back downstairs, cleaned up the dead flowers, and mopped up the puddle. I checked the time on my phone before I got back into bed. 3:31 a.m. Mason needed to stop this middle-of-the-night business if I was ever to get any sleep for work. But I didn't end up going to work. The next morning, as I was getting ready, Katie's husband called me. She'd been hit by a drunk driver walking out to her car the night before, and the paramedics who arrived at the scene had immediately pronounced her dead. Chris choked as he told me that what was left hadn't been in good enough shape to bury. Katie was going to be cremated. Her ashes preserved in a small ceramic urn. I hung up the phone, tears pouring down my cheeks as I thought back to my conversation with Sleep Mason this morning. A memorial urn wasn't much bigger than the flower vase he'd so messily liberated from our dining room table the night before. How had he known? Eventually, we chalked it up to coincidence. The days that followed were so horrible and chaotic, with preparations for the memorial service and arranging my temporary leave from work, that I simply couldn't deal with the idea that my son had added premonitions to his creepy list of nighttime activities. For the time being, he seemed to have stopped sleepwalking, and after a couple of weeks, I let myself hope that it had only been temporary. I couldn't deal with any more weird crap right now. But last night, I awoke to a strange clicking sound from Mason's room. I pulled out my phone to use the flashlight, noting that the time was once again 3:07 a.m. A feeling of dread settled into my stomach and camped there, and I swallowed against my sudden nausea at the thought of what Mason would say or do when I found him. Every step I took sent another chill down my spine, and I feel the tiny hairs on my arms standing straight up as though I'd been shocked. I peeked around the corner of Mason's room and was relieved to find him sitting on the floor playing with his blocks. We'd had a few problems with him sneaking out of his bed at night to play with his toys, though he usually went back to bed without a fight when we caught him. Another hollow lump and clicking reached my ears as I watched him carefully snapping the oversized toddler blocks together. It looked as though he was building a house of some sort. He had even given it a floor, and a divider ran across the middle of it. "Mason!" I snapped, relieved to find him doing something so normal. "What are you doing? It's 3 o'clock in the morning. It isn't playtime. Get back in your bed." He turned, slowly, and with horror I realized that he was wearing the same blank expression. "I'm not playing, Mommy," he said. What are you doing?" I hated how my voice broke on that word, how I was seriously considering waking my husband and asking him to come and help me. I hated being afraid of my son. "I'm building a box," he said. A box?" I swallowed, wondering what had happened to the sweet, happy little boy I'd played trains with only a few hours ago. He smiled, that razor-sharp smile again. "To put Ryan's eyes in when I cut them out." It's 3:06 now. I can hear him in his room. He's laughing. I know he's going to come out in a minute, and I don't know how to stop him. That's it. That's the end of the show. Welcome to the 100% scripted and pre-recorded portion of tonight's entertainment. If you liked what you heard, I'd be happier than a cat on a table full of antique glassware. As you know, cats love knocking things off tables. Well, if you liked it, comment on the video, like the video, dislike it if you disliked it. Let me know what you thought. I see every like, comment, and subscription. I'm always watching. You'll also find my Ethereum address, just in case you want to support me and my cryptocurrency gambling addiction. Just kidding though. Anyways, this now concludes the 100% scripted and pre-recorded portion of tonight's entertainment. Thank you for listening and have a great day.